The thrilling story begins with a young boy named Owen, who was about to sleep in his room. However, Owen was struggling to fall asleep, so he called his mother, Juliet. Owen told his mother that he was hearing strange noises, but Juliet did not feel anything unusual in his room. She assumed that Owen was just having a bad dream, so she told him to go back to sleep. The next day, Juliet and her husband, Richard, were enjoying their time sitting in a park while their son, Owen, was playing with other children. Juliet and Richard had not been living in this place for long. They had recently moved there due to work. They were hoping for a peaceful life in their new home. Richard's father used to live there, but Richard had a troubled past because his father used to beat him severely. He had shared all these painful memories with his wife, Juliet, to lighten his heart. Suddenly, a crowd started gathering in one part of the park. When Richard and Juliet reached the spot, they discovered that their son, Owen, had poked a horse's eye with a piece of wood, leaving the horse completely blind and in agony. Juliet and Richard apologized to everyone, quickly taking Owen away. If an adult had done such a thing, they would have been sent to jail. However, since Owen was just a child, people forgave him, considering it a mistake. Juliet and Richard immediately returned home to question their son about what had happened. To their shock, Owen admitted that he had done it intentionally but claimed that someone else was forcing him to do it. What disturbed his parents even more was that Owen showed no signs of guilt or remorse. He simply kept his head down without any expression of regret. It was also revealed that Owen had asthma, but the situation was becoming more complicated. Concerned about their son's behavior, Juliet and Richard took him to a psychiatrist. After listening to everything, the doctor suggested that since they had recently moved to a new place, Owen might just need time to adjust. The doctor advised them to spend as much time with Owen as possible. However, at that moment, a terrified Owen suddenly mentioned the name, Jack Gray. Hearing this name, Richard was also a bit startled. After coming home, Juliet asked her husband Richard about it, wanting to know who Jack Gray was. Richard then explained that Jack Gray was a figure from an ancient folklore, used to scare misbehaving children. Parents would warn them that, Jack Gray will come and get you if you misbehave. However, Richard didn't believe in such superstitions, though deep down, he had a feeling that someone must have been feeding these ideas to Owen. Richard suspected that their neighbor, Gordon, might be responsible. Gordon often looked after Owen when Juliet and Richard were away. He must have told Owen these useless stories, which led to Owen imagining all these things. Determined to set things right, Richard decided to take Owen for a walk. As they walked, he explained that such stories were baseless and should not be believed. He pointed out an old tree near their house, telling Owen that during festivals, people used to gather around it and pray. However, Gordon had told Owen a different version, that the tree was actually a gateway to another universe. That was why Owen kept thinking about it so often. Richard firmly warned Owen not to believe anything Gordon said. He told him that Gordon was highly superstitious and could mislead anyone. Richard tried his best to keep his son from going down the wrong path. Meanwhile, back at home, Juliet was outside, gazing at the scenery. Suddenly, she started seeing strange creatures, and the atmosphere around her began to change. She couldn't understand why these changes were happening, it all seemed normal at first. But then, out of nowhere, a thought struck her mind, Owen has fallen and is hurt. As soon as she snapped out of her trance, she turned around and saw that her thought had come true, Owen had indeed fallen. Juliet rushed toward her son, only to realize that he was having an asthma attack. He was struggling to breathe. Panicking, she immediately called Richard, and they rushed Owen to the hospital. Richard was terrified for his son, but the most shocking news was yet to come. The doctor approached Richard and Juliet with devastating news, your son, Owen, is no more. He had suffered an asthma attack, and due to the lack of timely treatment, he had passed away. Juliet and Richard were completely shattered. They couldn't understand why this had happened to them, but it was the harsh reality. They had no choice but to move forward. Some time later, it became evident that Juliet and Richard were no longer together. Juliet isolated herself in a room, constantly thinking about her son, while Richard buried himself in his work. As an archaeologist, he spent his time researching different animal species. However, deep down, Richard blamed Juliet for Owen's death. He believed that if Juliet had paid more attention to their son that day, this tragedy could have been avoided. In his mind, his wife's negligence was the reason for Owen's demise. One day, Juliet's best friend, Honey, came to visit her. Seeing Honey made Juliet feel a little better, and she slowly started interacting again. Honey and her friends knew the pain Juliet was going through. After losing her son, she had been left completely alone. To cheer her up, they spent quality time together. Meanwhile, Gordon had to leave town for some work, so he asked his friend, Mrs. Ferd, to stay at Richard's house for a few days. Mrs. Ferd was a firm believer in magic, spells, and spirits. When she arrived at the house, she quickly learned how Owen had died. However, she told Juliet something shocking. "Your son may be dead, but his soul is still wandering here. He will not leave until you tell him to." Juliet and her friend Honey slowly started believing in Mrs. Ferd's words. Mrs. Ferd then revealed a ritual that could help Owen's soul find peace. Desperate to connect with her son one last time, Juliet blindly followed every step of the ritual. After performing all the steps exactly as Mrs. Ferd had instructed, Juliet was finally able to set her son's spirit free. Juliet finally felt a bit relieved. She had, in a way, helped her son's soul find peace. But when Richard found out about everything, he was furious. He stormed in, yelling, as he didn't believe in such things at all. Meanwhile, Richard had been conducting research on a set of skeletons he had found, specifically, those of a rabbit. But after some time, when he looked at the skeleton again, he was shocked to see that more flesh had started to appear on it. The bones seemed to be regenerating flesh on their own. Richard was stunned. How could this be happening? He immediately rushed to his friend, Stephen, to show him the discovery. But Stephen dismissed it, saying it was impossible. He explained that since Richard had just recently removed the flesh from the rabbit's body, some tissue must have remained on the bones, giving the illusion of regeneration. But Richard knew better. This was beyond science. It was impossible by any natural means. He decided to keep a close watch on the skeleton. As days passed, he observed something truly disturbing. The rabbit's flesh kept growing back. Eventually, it reached a point where Richard could even see the heart beating inside the reformed body. The rabbit was coming back to life. Richard couldn't comprehend how this was happening. What kind of rabbit was this? Even after death, its skeleton was somehow reviving a living creature. He decided to keep this discovery a secret from everyone. But before he could hide it, Juliet walked in and saw the rabbit. When Richard told her what had happened, she wasn't as shocked as he had expected. Instead, she began speaking to the rabbit affectionately, as if it were her own child. Richard realized that Juliet wasn't just seeing a rabbit, she was seeing Owen in it. The way she interacted with the creature, the care and love she showed, made it clear that she felt an emotional connection to it. Juliet, who had once locked herself away in her room in grief, now seemed like a completely different person. She was happy again, engaging with the world around her. Richard never could have expected this outcome, but he noticed something undeniable. This rabbit's existence had brought Juliet back to life. She spent all her time with the rabbit, playing with it, nurturing it. And in some way, Richard observed that because of this strange creature, Juliet had started talking to him properly again. Their old life, the love and warmth they had once shared, seemed to be slowly returning. Richard was feeling good about everything, which is why he didn't let Juliet separate from the rabbit. By now, Juliet had developed immense respect for the rabbit. She treated it completely like her own child and provided it with every possible facility. That night, when Richard was with Juliet, he started telling her about his past. He said, "My father never treated me well. He would get angry and yell at me, then leave me naked in a field. This would go on until I collapsed, almost as if I were dead." Richard believed that his father did all this on purpose. Like Gordon, Richard's father also believed in ghosts, spirits, and superstitions. Near their house stood a tree that was said to be connected to several spirits. Richard's father believed that the tree was a gateway to another world, one where a demon could be summoned to fulfill all wishes. However, to open the door to that world, a sacrifice was required. In other words, Richard's father was preparing to kill his own son for the ritual. But for some reason, he was never able to go through with it. Thinking about all this, Richard fell into deep depression, wondering why his father hated him so much. Not wanting to burden Juliet with his troubles, he left her with the rabbit. Meanwhile, Honey was shown reading a book in Richard's room. The book described the same tree, referred to as the oak tree. It was written that every year, the villagers gathered near the oak tree and worshipped it as part of a festival. As a part of this ritual, 3 people were sacrificed, always individuals who were very close to each other. By performing this ritual, a dangerous force would be unleashed, fulfilling the wishes of the villagers. The book also mentioned a name, Jack Gray, the one who was supposed to arrive after the ritual was completed. This was the same Jack Gray whom Owen used to call upon. Jack Gray could be considered a demon who would emerge from the other world once the ritual was complete. The book even had illustrations depicting people gathering near the oak tree, where 3 individuals would be sacrificed, 1 boy, 1 female, and 1 male member. Everything in the book was described in such a complex manner that Honey couldn't fully understand it. Still, she chose not to tell Richard about it. Meanwhile, Richard, already drowning in depression due to his father's past actions, finally realized the horrifying truth. His father had intended to sacrifice him to open the portal. that was why he had tortured Richard for so long. But his plan had failed because the ritual only accepted a sacrifice of someone who was truly loved by the one offering them. Richard's father had no emotional attachment to him and didn't love him at all. Because of this, the sacrifice was never accepted, and Richard survived. Slowly, Richard started sinking further into negativity, as if he were developing multiple personalities. At the same time, Juliet had grown incredibly attached to the rabbit. She spent every moment with it, treating it as if it were her own child. Even when the rabbit bit Honey, instead of scolding the rabbit, Juliet blamed Honey and took the rabbit outside. Her love for the creature was only intensifying. Meanwhile, Richard was shown searching for the roots of the fallen oak tree, because he wanted to regrow it. His reasons for doing this would soon become clear. At that moment, Richard's friend, Steve, arrived and tried to stop him, warning that their ancestors had cut down the oak tree for a reason, to prevent dark spirits from entering this world. This was even written in the book. But for some reason, Richard ignored Steve's warnings. Then, Juliet had a vision. She believed that Steve had come to kill her rabbit. Driven by this thought, she grabbed a knife and attacked Steve, killing him in a gruesome manner. Richard saw this, but instead of reacting with shock or horror, he simply told Juliet, "We need to hide the body." Richard clearly had a twisted plan in mind, which would soon be revealed. Together, they buried Steve's corpse deep within the tree's roots. A little while later, Juliet and Richard were back in their room, calling for Honey to come and talk to them. Unaware of what had just happened, Honey arrived without hesitation. Juliet distracted Honey by showing her the rabbit, keeping her attention elsewhere. But in that very moment, Richard attacked Honey from behind with full force, killing her instantly. Juliet's face remained emotionless. She simply stated, "Our work is done. Jack Gray will come into this world, and we can have our wishes fulfilled." She then picked up the rabbit and held it tightly against her chest. At this moment, the truth became clear. Juliet and Richard had planned everything from the very beginning. The reason they had moved to this place was to resurrect the demon named Jack Gray. But Jack Gray could only return to this world if the oak tree ritual was completed. According to the ritual, 3 sacrifices were needed. The most shocking revelation was that the first sacrifice, a child, had been none other than Juliet's own son. There was a scene where Juliet admitted to her husband, "I could have saved him, but I let him die, just to complete this ritual." After sacrificing a child, Richard and Juliet killed Steve, who served as the male offering for the ritual. And finally, they killed Honey, fulfilling the requirement of a sacrificed female. Now, the ritual was complete. All 3 victims had been deeply connected to them, making them perfect sacrifices. This meant that Jack Gray had been successfully summoned back into the world. But Jack Gray wasn't just anywhere, he was inside the rabbit. In the beginning, when Richard had dug up the tree's roots, he had discovered bones. Those were the remains of Jack Gray. Slowly, the demon had taken the form of a rabbit, and now that the ritual was complete, Jack Gray's soul had fully merged with the creature. Richard and Juliet could now ask the demon for whatever they desired. But there was another shocking twist. Gordon had known about this entire process from the start. In fact, at Richard's request, Gordon had deliberately told Owen these stories, confusing him so much that he would believe these were mere accidents rather than murders. Gordon's friend, Mrs. Ford, also knew about everything. However, Mrs. Ford had deliberately told Juliet that her child's spirit was still in the house. By completing a small ritual, she had managed to clear Juliet's mind. If Juliet had continued in her grieving state, she might have starved herself to death, and the process of bringing the demon into this world would never have been completed. It was also possible that Gordon and Mrs. Ford planned to ask the demon for their own wishes as well. In the end, it became clear that everyone had started sacrificing their own family members for their personal gain. And with this chilling and dangerous ending, the story comes to a close.